KaraokeBooks.
In Search of Lost Time. Swann's Way. Marcel Proust. Translated by C.K.Scott-Moncrieff. He could hear the jokes that me, Verdurin would make after dinner, jokes which, whoever the bore might be at whom they were aimed, had always amused him because he could watch Odette laughing at them, laughing with him, her laughter almost a part of his. Now he felt that it was possibly at him that they would make Odette laugh. "What a fetid form of humor!" he exclaimed, twisting his mouth into an expression of disgust so violent that he could feel the muscles of his throat stiffen against his collar. How, in God's name, can a creature made in his image find anything to laugh at in those nauseating witticisms? The least sensitive nose must be driven away in horror from such stale exhalations. It is really impossible to believe that any human being is incapable of understanding that, in allowing herself merely to smile at the expense of a fellow creature who has loyally held out his hand to her, she is casting herself into a mire from which it will be impossible, with the best will in the world, ever to rescue her. I dwell so many miles above the puddles in which these filthy little vermin sprawl and crawl and bawl their cheap obscenities, that I cannot possibly be spattered by the witticisms of a Verdurin," he cried, tossing up his head and arrogantly straightening his body. "God knows that I have honestly attempted to pull Odette out of that sewer, and to teach her to breathe a nobler and a purer air. But human patience has its limits, and mine is at an end," he concluded, as though this sacred mission to tear Odette away from an atmosphere of sarcasms dated from longer than a few minutes ago, as though he had not undertaken it only since it had occurred to him that those sarcasms might, perchance, be directed at himself, and might have the effect of detaching Odette from him. He could see the pianist sitting down to play the Moonlight Sonata, and the grimaces of me, Verdurin, in terrified anticipation of the wrecking of her nerves by Beethoven's music. "Idiot, liar," he shouted, "and a creature like that imagines that she's fond of art," she would say to Odette, after deftly insinuating a few words of praise for Forcheval, as she had so often done for himself. "You can make room for M. de Forcheval there, can't you, Odette? In the dark, codfish. Pander." Pander was the name he applied also to the music which would invite them to sit in silence, to dream together, to gaze in each other's eyes, to feel for each other's hands. He felt that there was much to be said, after all, for a sternly censorious attitude towards the arts, such as Plato adopted and Bossuet, and the old school of education in France. In a word, the life which they led at the Verdurins, which he had so often described as genuine, seemed to him now the worst possible form of life, and their little nucleus, the most degraded class of society. "It really is," he repeated, "beneath the lowest rung of the social ladder, the nethermost circle of Dante." Beyond a doubt, the august words of the Florentine refer to the Verdurins. When one comes to think of it, surely people, in society, and, though one may find fault with them now and then, still, after all they are a very different matter from that gang of blackmailers, show a profound sagacity in refusing to know them, or even to dirty the tips of their fingers with them. What a sound intuition there is in that "Noli me tangere" motto of the Faubourg Saint-Germain. He had long since emerged from the paths and avenues of the Bois, he had almost reached his own house, and still, for he had not yet thrown off the intoxication of grief, or his whim of insincerity, but was ever more and more exhilarated by the false intonation, the artificial sonority of his own voice, he continued to perorate aloud in the silence of the night. "People, in society, have their failings, as no one knows better than I, but, after all, they are people to whom some things, at least, are impossible. So and so, a fashionable woman whom he had known, was far from being perfect, but, after all, one did find in her a fundamental delicacy, a loyalty in her conduct which made her, whatever happened, incapable of a felony, which fixes a vast gulf between her and an old hag like Verdurin." Verdurin. What a name! Oh, there's something complete about them, something almost fine in their trueness to type. They're the most perfect specimens of their disgusting class. Thank God, it was high time that I stopped condescending to promiscuous intercourse with such infamy, such dung. But, just as the virtues which he had still attributed, an hour or so earlier, to the Verdurins, would not have sufficed, even although the Verdurins had actually possessed them, if they had not also favored and protected his love, to excite Swann to that state of intoxication in which he waxed tender over their magnanimity, an intoxication which, even when disseminated through the medium of other persons, could have come to him from Odette alone, so the immorality, had it really existed, which he now found in the Verdurins would have been powerless, if they had not invited Odette with Forcheville and without him, to unstop the vials of his wrath and to make him scarify their infamy. Doubtless Swann's voice showed a finer perspicacity than his own when it refused to utter those words full of disgust at the Verdurins and their circle, and of joy at his having shaken himself free of it, save in an artificial and rhetorical tone. The latter, in fact, while he abandoned himself to invective, were probably, though he did not know it, occupied with a wholly different matter, for once he had reached his house, no sooner had he closed the front door behind him than he suddenly struck his forehead, and, making his servant open the door again, dashed out into the street shouting, in a voice which, this time, was quite natural, "I believe I have found a way of getting invited to the dinner at Chatou tomorrow." But it must have been a bad way, for M. Swann was not invited. Dr. Cottard, who, having been summoned to attend a serious case in the country, had not seen the Verdurins for some days, and had been prevented from appearing at Chatou, said, on the evening after this dinner, as he sat down to table at their house, "Why, aren't we going to see M. Swann this evening? He is quite what you might call a personal friend. I sincerely trust that we shan't," cried me. Verdurin. "Heaven preserve us from him, he's too deadly for words, a stupid, ill-bred boor." On hearing these words Cottard exhibited an intense astonishment blended with entire submission, as though in the face of a scientific truth which contradicted everything that he had previously believed, but was supported by an irresistible weight of evidence. With timorous emotion he bowed his head over his plate, and merely replied, "Oh, oh, 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 oh," traversing, in an orderly retirement of his forces, into the depths of his being, along a descending scale, the whole compass of his voice. After which there was no more talk of Swann at the Verdurins. And so that drawing-room which had brought Swann and Odette together became an obstacle in the way of their meeting. She no longer said to him, as she had said in the early days of their love, "We shall meet, anyhow, tomorrow evening. There's a supper party at the Verdurins, but we shan't be able to meet tomorrow evening. There's a supper party at the Verdurins." Or else the Verdurins were taking her to the Opéra Comique, to see Une Nuit de Cléopâtre, and Swann could read in her eyes that terror lest he should ask her not to go, which, but a little time before, he could not have refrained from greeting with a kiss as it flitted across the face of his mistress, but which now exasperated him. "Yet I'm not really angry," he assured himself, "when I see how she longs to run away and scratch for maggots in that dunghill of cacophony. I'm disappointed, not for myself, but for her, disappointed to find that, after living for more than 6 months in daily contact with myself, she has not been capable of improving her mind even to the point of spontaneously eradicating from it a taste for Victor Massé. More than that, to find that she has not arrived at the stage of understanding that there are evenings on which anyone with the least shade of refinement of feeling should be willing to forego an amusement when she is asked to do so. She ought to have the sense to say, 'I shall not go,' if it were only from policy, since it is by what she answers now that the quality of her soul will be determined once and for all." And having persuaded himself that it was solely, after all, in order that he might arrive at a favorable estimate of Odette's spiritual worth that he wished her to stay at home with him that evening instead of going to the Opéra Comique, he adopted the same line of reasoning with her, with the same degree of insincerity as he had used with himself, or even with a degree more, for in her case he was yielding also to the desire to capture her by her own self-esteem. "I swear to you," he told her, shortly before she was to leave for the theater, "that, in asking you not to go, I should hope, were I a selfish man, for nothing so much as that you should refuse, for I have 1,000 other things to do this evening, and I shall feel that I have been tricked and trapped myself, and shall be thoroughly annoyed if, after all, you tell me that you are not going. But my occupations, my pleasures are not everything. I must think of you also. A day may come when, seeing me irrevocably sundered from you, you will be entitled to reproach me with not having warned you at the decisive hour in which I felt that I was going to pass judgment on you. One of those stern judgments which love cannot long resist. You see, your Nuit de Cléopâtre, what a title, has no bearing on the point. What I must know is whether you are indeed one of those creatures in the lowest grade of mentality and even of charm, one of those contemptible creatures who are incapable of foregoing a pleasure. For if you are such, how could anyone love you, for you are not even a person, a definite, imperfect, but at least perceptible entity. You are a formless water that will trickle down any slope that it may come upon, a fish devoid of memory, incapable of thought, which all its life long in its aquarium will continue to dash itself, 100 times a day, against a wall of glass, always mistaking it for water. Do you realize that your answer will have the effect, I do not say of making me cease from that moment to love you, that goes without saying, but of making you less attractive to my eyes when I realize that you are not a person, that you are beneath everything in the world and have not the intelligence to raise yourself 1 inch higher? Obviously, I should have preferred to ask you, as though it had been a matter of little or no importance, to give up your Nuit de Cléopâtre, since you compel me to sully my lips with so abject a name, in the hope that you would go to it none the less. But, since I had resolved to weigh you in the balance, to make so grave an issue depend upon your answer, I considered it more honorable to give you due warning. Meanwhile, Odette had shown signs of increasing emotion and uncertainty. Although the meaning of his tirade was beyond her, she grasped that it was to be included among the scenes of reproach or supplication, scenes which her familiarity with the ways of men enabled her, without paying any heed to the words that were uttered, to conclude that men would not make unless they were in love, that, from the moment when they were in love, it was superfluous to obey them, since they would only be more in love later on. And so, she would have heard Swann out with the utmost tranquility had she not noticed that it was growing late, and that if he went on speaking for any length of time she would never, as she told him with a fond smile, obstinate but slightly abashed, get there in time for the overture. On other occasions he had assured himself that the one thing which, more than anything else, would make him cease to love her, would be her refusal to abandon the habit of lying. Even from the point of view of coquetry, pure and simple, he had told her, "Can't you see how much of your attraction you throw away when you stoop to lying? By a frank admission, how many faults you might redeem. Really, you are far less intelligent than I supposed." In vain, however, did Swann expound to her thus all the reasons that she had for not lying. They might have succeeded in overthrowing any universal system of mendacity, but Odette had no such system. She contented herself, merely, whenever she wished Swann to remain in ignorance of anything that she had done, with not telling him of it. So that a lie was, to her, something to be used only as a special expedient, and the one thing that could make her decide whether she should avail herself of a lie or not was a reason which, too, was of a special and contingent order, namely the risk of Swann's discovering that she had not told him the truth. Physically, she was passing through an unfortunate phase. She was growing stouter, and the expressive, sorrowful charm, the surprised, wistful expressions which she had formerly had, seemed to have vanished with her first youth, with the result that she became most precious to Swann at the very moment when he found her distinctly less good-looking. He would gaze at her for hours on end, trying to recapture the charm which he had once seen in her and could not find again. And yet the knowledge that, within this new and strange chrysalis, it was still Odette that lurked, still the same volatile temperament, artful and evasive, was enough to keep Swann seeking, with as much passion as ever, to captivate her. Then he would look at photographs of her, taken 2 years before, and would remember how exquisite she had been. And that would console him, a little, for all the sufferings that he voluntarily endured on her account. When the Verdurins took her off to Saint-Germain, or to Chatou, or to Moulins, as often as not, if the weather was fine, they would propose to remain there for the night, and not go home until next day. Me. Verdurin would endeavor to set at rest the scruples of the pianist, whose aunt had remained in Paris. She will be only too glad to be rid of you for a day. How on earth could she be anxious when she knows you're with us? Anyhow, I'll take you all under my wing. She can put the blame on me. If this attempt failed, Verdurin would set off across country until he came to a telegraph office or some other kind of messenger, after first finding out which of the faithful had anyone whom they must warn. But Odette would thank him, and assure him that she had no message for anyone, for she had told Swann, once and for all, that she could not possibly send messages to him, before all those people, without compromising herself. Sometimes she would be absent for several days on end, when the Verdurins took her to see the tombs at Dreux, or to Compiègne, on the painter's advice, to watch the sun setting through the forest. After which they went on to the chateau of Pierrefonds. To think that she could visit really historic buildings with me, who have spent 10 years in the study of architecture, who am constantly bombarded by people who really count, to take them over Beauvais or Saint Loup de Nau, and refuse to take anyone but her. And instead of that she trundles off with the lowest, the most brutally degraded of creatures, to go into ecstasies over the petrified excretions of Louis Philippe and Viollet-le-Duc. One hardly needs much knowledge of art, I should say, to do that, though, surely, even without any particularly refined sense of smell, one would not deliberately choose to spend a holiday in the latrines, so as to be within range of their fragrant exhalations. But when she had set off for Dreux or Pierrefonds, alas, without allowing him to appear there, as though by accident, at her side, for, as she said, that would create a dreadful impression, he would plunge into the most intoxicating romance in the lover's library, the railway timetable, from which he learned the ways of joining her there in the afternoon, in the evening, even in the morning. The ways? More than that, the authority, the right to join her. For, after all, the timetable, and the trains themselves, were not meant for dogs. If the public were carefully informed, by means of printed advertisements, that at 8 o'clock in the morning a train started for Pierrefonds which arrived there at 10, that could only be because going to Pierrefonds was a lawful act, for which permission from Odette would be superfluous. An act, moreover, which might be performed from a motive altogether different from the desire to see Odette, since persons who had never even heard of her performed it daily, and in such numbers as justified the labor and expense of stoking the engines. So it came to this, that she could not prevent him from going to Pierrefonds if he chose to do so. Now that was precisely what he found that he did choose to do, and would at that moment be doing were he, like the traveling public, not acquainted with Odette. For a long time past he had wanted to form a more definite impression of Viollet-le-Duc's work as a restorer. And the weather being what it was, he felt an overwhelming desire to spend the day roaming in the forest of Compiègne. It was, indeed, a piece of bad luck that she had forbidden him access to the one spot that tempted him today. Today. Why, if he went down there, in defiance of her prohibition, he would be able to see her that very day. But then, whereas, if she had met, at Pierrefonds, someone who did not matter, she would have hailed him with obvious pleasure. What, you hear? And would have invited him to come and see her at the hotel where she was staying with the Verdurins. If, on the other hand, it was himself, Swann, that she encountered there, she would be annoyed, would complain that she was being followed, would love him less in consequence, might even turn away in anger when she caught sight of him. So, then, I am not to be allowed to go away for a day anywhere. She would reproach him on her return, whereas in fact it was he himself who was not allowed to go. He had had the sudden idea, so as to contrive to visit Compiègne and Pierrefonds without letting it be supposed that his object was to meet Odette, of securing an invitation from one of his friends, the Marquis de Forestel, who had a country house in that neighborhood. This friend, to whom Swann suggested the plan without disclosing its ulterior purpose, was beside himself with joy. He did not conceal his astonishment at Swann's consenting at last, after 15 years, to come down and visit his property, and since he did not, he told him, wished to stay there, promised to spend some days, at least, in taking him for walks and excursions in the district. Swann imagined himself down there already with M. de Forestel. Even before he saw Odette, even if he did not succeed in seeing her there, what a joy it would be to set foot on that soil where, not knowing the exact spot in which, at any moment, she was to be found, he would feel all around him the thrilling possibility of her suddenly appearing. In the courtyard of the chateau, now beautiful in his eyes since it was on her account that he had gone to visit it, in all the streets of the town, which struck him as romantic, down every ride of the forest, roseate with the deep and tender glow of sunset. Innumerable and alternative hiding places, to which would fly simultaneously for refuge, in the uncertain ubiquity of his hopes, his happy, vagabond and divided heart. We mustn't, on any account, he would warn M. de Forestel, run across Odette and the Verdurins. I have just heard that they are at Pierrefonds, of all places, today. One has plenty of time to see them in Paris. It would hardly be worth while coming down here if one couldn't go a yard without meeting them. And his host would fail to understand why, once they had reached the place, Swann would change his plans 20 times in an hour. Inspect the dining rooms of all the hotels in Compiègne without being able to make up his mind to settle down in any of them, although he had found no trace anywhere of the Verdurins, seeming to be in search of what he had claimed to be most anxious to avoid, and would in fact avoid, the moment he found it, for if he had come upon the little group, he would have hastened away at once with studied indifference, satisfied that he had seen Odette and she him, especially that she had seen him when he was not, apparently, thinking about her. But no, she would guess at once that it was for her sake that he had come there. And when M. de Forestel came to fetch him, and it was time to start, he excused himself. No, I'm afraid not. I can't go to Pierrefonds today. You see, Odette is there. And Swann was happy in spite of everything in feeling that if he, alone among mortals, had not the right to go to Pierrefonds that day, it was because he was in fact, for Odette, someone who differed from all other mortals, her lover. And because that restriction which for him alone was set upon the universal right to travel freely where one would, was but one of the many forms of that slavery, that love which was so dear to him. Decidedly, it was better not to risk a quarrel with her, to be patient, to wait for her return. He spent his days in poring over a map of the forest of Compiègne, as though it had been that of the Pays du Tendre. He surrounded himself with photographs of the chateau of Pierrefonds. When the day dawned on which it was possible that she might return, he opened the timetable again, calculated what train she must have taken, and, should she have postponed her departure, what trains were still left for her to take. He did not leave the house, for fear of missing a telegram. He did not go to bed, in case, having come by the last train, she decided to surprise him with a midnight visit. Yes. The front door bell rang. There seemed some delay in opening the door. He wanted to awaken the porter. He leaned out of the window to shout to Odette. If it was Odette, for in spite of the orders which he had gone downstairs a dozen times to deliver in person, they were quite capable of telling her that he was not at home. It was only a servant coming in. He noticed the incessant rumble of passing carriages, to which he had never before paid any attention. He could hear them, one after another, a long way off, coming nearer, passing his door without stopping, and bearing away into the distance a message which was not for him. He waited all night, to no purpose, for the Verdurins had returned unexpectedly, and Odette had been in Paris since midday. It had not occurred to her to tell him. Not knowing what to do with herself, she had spent the evening alone at a theater, had long since gone home to bed, and was peacefully asleep. As a matter of fact, she had never given him a thought. And such moments as these, in which she forgot Swann's very existence, were of more value to Odette, did more to attach him to her, than all her infidelities. For in this way Swann was kept in that state of painful agitation which had once before been effective in making his interest blossom into love, on the night when he had failed to find Odette at the Verdurins and had hunted for her all evening. And he did not have, as I had, afterwards, at Cambrai in my childhood, happy days in which to forget the sufferings that would return with the night. For his days, Swann must pass them without Odette, and as he told himself, now and then, to allow so pretty a woman to go out by herself in Paris was just as rash as to leave a case filled with jewels in the middle of the street. In this mood he would scowl furiously at the passers-by, as though they were so many pickpockets. But their faces, a collective and formless mass, escaped the grasp of his imagination, and so failed to feed the flame of his jealousy. The effort exhausted Swann's brain, until, passing his hand over his eyes, he cried out, "Heaven help me," as people, after lashing themselves into an intellectual frenzy in their endeavors to master the problem of the reality of the external world, or that of the immortality of the soul, afford relief to their weary brains by an unreasoning act of faith. But the thought of his absent mistress was incessantly, indissolubly blended with all the simplest actions of Swann's daily life. When he took his meals, opened his letters, went for a walk or to bed, by the fact of his regret at having to perform those actions without her. Like those initials of Philibert the Fair which, in the church of Brau, because of her grief, her longing for him, Margaret of Austria intertwined everywhere with her own. On some days, instead of staying at home, he would go for luncheon to a restaurant not far off, to which he had been attracted, some time before, by the excellence of its cookery, but to which he now went only for one of those reasons, at once mystical and absurd, which people call romantic, because this restaurant, which, by the way, still exists, bore the same name as the street in which Odette lived, the Lapierre House. Sometimes, when she had been away on a short visit somewhere, several days would elapse before she thought of letting him know that she had returned to Paris. And then she would say quite simply, without taking, as she would once have taken, the precaution of covering herself, at all costs, with a little fragment borrowed from the truth, that she had just, at that very moment, arrived by the morning train. What she said was a falsehood, at least for Odette it was a falsehood, inconsistent, lacking, what it would have had, if true, the support of her memory of her actual arrival at the station. She was even prevented from forming a mental picture of what she was saying, while she said it, by the contradictory picture, in her mind, of whatever quite different thing she had indeed been doing at the moment when she pretended to have been alighting from the train. In Swann's mind, however, these words, meeting no opposition, settled and hardened until they assumed the indestructibility of a truth so indubitable that, if some friend happened to tell him that he had come by the same train and had not seen Odette, Swann would have been convinced that it was his friend who had made a mistake as to the day or hour, since his version did not agree with the words uttered by Odette. These words had never appeared to him false except when, before hearing them, he had suspected that they were going to be. For him to believe that she was lying, an anticipatory suspicion was indispensable. It was also, however, sufficient. Given that, everything that Odette might say appeared to him suspect. Did she mention a name? It was obviously that of one of her lovers. Once this supposition had taken shape, he would spend weeks in tormenting himself. On one occasion he even approached a firm of inquiry agents, to find out the address and the occupation of the unknown rival who would give him no peace until he could be proved to have gone abroad, and who, he ultimately learned, was an uncle of Odette, and had been dead for 20 years. Although she would not allow him, as a rule, to meet her at public gatherings, saying that people would talk, it happened occasionally that, at an evening party to which he and she had each been invited, at Forcheville's, at the painter's, or at a charity ball given in one of the ministries, he found himself in the same room with her. He could see her, but dared not remain for fear of annoying her by seeming to be spying upon the pleasures which she tasted in other company, pleasures which, while he drove home in utter loneliness, and went to bed, as anxiously as I myself was to go to bed, some years later, on the evenings when he came to dine with us at Cambrai, seemed illimitable to him since he had not been able to see their end. And, once or twice, he derived from such evenings that kind of happiness which one would be inclined, did it not originate in so violent a reaction from an anxiety abruptly terminated, to call peaceful, since it consists in a pacifying of the mind. He had looked in for a moment at a revel in the painter's studio, and was getting ready to go home. He was leaving behind him Odette, transformed into a brilliant stranger, surrounded by men to whom her glances and her gaiety, which were not for him, seemed to hint at some voluptuous pleasure to be enjoyed there or elsewhere, possibly at the bal des incohérents, to which he trembled to think that she might be going on afterwards, which made Swann more jealous than the thought of their actual physical union, since it was more difficult to imagine. He was opening the door to go, when he heard himself called back in these words, which, by cutting off from the party that possible ending which had so appalled him, made the party itself seem innocent in retrospect, made Odette's return home a thing no longer inconceivable and terrible, but tender and familiar, a thing that kept close to his side, like a part of his own daily life, in his carriage, a thing that stripped Odette herself of the excessive brilliance and gaiety in her appearance, showed that it was only a disguise which she had assumed for a moment, for his sake and not in view of any mysterious pleasures, a disguise of which she had already wearied, in these words, "I'm just going. We'll drive back together and you can drop me." It was true that on one occasion Forcheville had asked to be driven home at the same time, but when, on reaching Odette's gate, he had begged to be allowed to come in too, she had replied, with a finger pointed at Swann, "Ah, that depends on this gentleman. You must ask him." "Very well, you may come in, just for a minute, if you insist, but you mustn't stay long, for, I warn you, he likes to sit and talk quietly with me, and he's not at all pleased if I have visitors when he's here." "Oh, if you only knew the creature as I know him. Isn't that so, my love? There's no one that really knows you, is there, except me?" And Swann was, perhaps, even more touched by the spectacle of her addressing him thus, in front of Forcheville, not only in these tender words of predilection, but also with certain criticisms, such as, "I feel sure you haven't written yet to your friends, about dining with them on Sunday. You needn't go if you don't want to, but you might at least be polite, or, now, have you left your essay on Vermeer here, so that you can do a little more to it tomorrow? What a lazy bones. I'm going to make you work, I can tell you," which proved that Odette kept herself in touch with his social engagements and his literary work, that they had indeed a life in common. And as she spoke she bestowed on him a smile which he interpreted as meaning that she was entirely his. And then, while she was making them some orangeade, suddenly, just as when the reflector of a lamp that is badly fitted begins by casting all round an object, on the wall beyond it, huge and fantastic shadows which, in time, contract and are lost in the shadow of the object itself, all the terrible and disturbing ideas which he had formed of Odette melted away and vanished in the charming creature who stood there before his eyes. He had the sudden suspicion that this hour spent in Odette's house, in the lamp-light, was, perhaps, after all, not an artificial hour, invented for his special use, with the object of concealing that frightening and delicious thing which was incessantly in his thoughts without his ever being able to form a satisfactory impression of it, an hour of Odette's real life, of her life when he was not there, looking on, with theatrical properties and pasteboard fruits, but was perhaps a genuine hour of Odette's life, that, if he himself had not been there, she would have pulled forward the same armchair for Forcheville, would have poured out for him, not any unknown brew, but precisely that orangeade which she was now offering to them both, that the world inhabited by Odette was not that other world, fearful and supernatural, in which he spent his time in placing her, and which existed, perhaps, only in his imagination, but the real universe, exhaling no special atmosphere of gloom, comprising that table at which he might sit down, presently, and write, and this drink which he was being permitted, now, to taste, all the objects which he contemplated with as much curiosity and admiration as gratitude. For if, in absorbing his dreams, they had delivered him from an obsession, they themselves were, in turn, enriched by the absorption, they showed him the palpable realization of his fancies, and they interested his mind, they took shape and grew solid before his eyes. Ah! had fate but allowed him to share a single dwelling with Odette, so that in her house he should be in his own. If, when asking his servant what there would be for luncheon, it had been Odette's bill of fare that he had learned from the reply. If, when Odette wished to go for a walk, in the morning, along the Avenue du Bois de Boulogne, his duty as a good husband had obliged him, though he had no desire to go out, to accompany her, carrying her cloak when she was too warm, and in the evening, after dinner, if she wished to stay at home, and not to dress, if he had been forced to stay beside her, to do what she asked, then how completely would all the trivial details of Swann's life, which seemed to him now so gloomy, simply because they would, at the same time, have formed part of the life of Odette, have taken on, like that lamp, that orangeade, that armchair, which had absorbed so much of his dreams, which materialized so much of his longing, and yet he was inclined to suspect that the state for which he so much longed was a calm, a peace, which would not have created an atmosphere favorable to his love. When Odette ceased to be for him a creature always absent, regretted, imagined, when the feeling that he had for her was no longer the same mysterious disturbance that was wrought in him by the phrase from the sonata, but constant affection and gratitude, when those normal relations were established between them which would put an end to his melancholy madness, then, no doubt, the actions of Odette's daily life would appear to him as being of but little intrinsic interest, as he had several times, already, felt that they might be, on the day, for instance, when he had read, through its envelope, her letter to Forcheville. Examining his complaint with as much scientific detachment as if he had inoculated himself with it in order to study its effects, he told himself that, when he was cured of it, what Odette might or might not do would be indifferent to him. But in his morbid state, to tell the truth, he feared death itself no more than such a recovery, which would, in fact, amount to the death of all that he then was. After these quiet evenings, Swann's suspicions would be temporarily lulled. He would bless the name of Odette, and next day, in the morning, would order the most attractive jewels to be sent to her, because her kindnesses to him overnight had excited either his gratitude, or the desire to see them repeated, or a paroxysm of love for her which had need of some such outlet. But at other times, grief would again take hold of him. He would imagine that Odette was Forcheville's mistress, and that, when they had both sat watching him from the depths of the Verdurins' landau, in the Bois, on the evening before the party at Chatou to which he had not been invited, while he implored her in vain, with that look of despair on his face which even his coachman had noticed, to come home with him, and then turned away, solitary, crushed, she must have employed, to draw Forcheville's attention to him, while she murmured, "Do look at him," storming. The same glance, brilliant, malicious, sidelong, cunning, as on the evening when Forcheville had driven Saniette from the Verdurins. At such times Swann detested her. "But I've been a fool, too," he would argue. "I'm paying for other men's pleasures with my money. All the same, she'd better take care, and not pull the string too often, for I might very well stop giving her anything at all. At any rate, we'd better knock off supplementary favors for the time being. To think that, only yesterday, when she said she would like to go to Bayreuth for the season, I was such an ass as to offer to take one of those jolly little places the King of Bavaria has there, for the two of us. However, she didn't seem particularly keen. She hasn't said yes or no yet. Let's hope that she'll refuse. Good God! Think of listening to Wagner for a fortnight on end with her, who takes about as much interest in music as a fish does in little apples. It will be fun. And his hatred, like his love, needing to manifest itself in action, he amused himself with urging his evil imaginings further and further, because, thanks to the perfidies with which he charged Odette, he detested her still more, and would be able, if it turned out, as he tried to convince himself, that she was indeed guilty of them, to take the opportunity of punishing her, emptying upon her the overflowing vials of his wrath. In this way, he went so far as to suppose that he was going to receive a letter from her, in which she would ask him for money to take the house at Bayreuth, but with the warning that he was not to come there himself, as she had promised Forcheville and the Verdurins to invite them. Oh, how he would have loved it, had it been conceivable that she would have that audacity. What joy he would have in refusing, in drawing up that vindictive reply, the terms of which he amused himself by selecting and declaiming aloud, as though he had actually received her letter.
If you liked what you heard, please subscribe to the channel.